Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Prentke, and this is Boss Bones. And I'm super excited to have Liza Malamut on today's show. Um, so, I very briefly met Liza years ago. I don't even know if you would remember that, but I happened to be playing a handful of gigs with um, early music specialist and recorder maestro John Tyson of the Renaissonics. So I was actually for a short while playing some gigs with him, which was super fun. And it was a really interesting window into that world of early music. And I remember in passing, I think I saw Liza play with another group at what's the annual festival? The Boston.
The Boston Early Music Festival, maybe?
Right, that's
Yeah.
the one, Boston Early Music Festival. Anyways, I'm just super excited to have you on because you're such a specialist in this world, and it's such a really interesting kind of thing that I think I think there's a really strong scene for that here, and not a lot of people know about it. So I'm excited to hear from you. Anyways, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I was wondering what brought you to Boston in the first place?
Well, I actually came to Boston originally for my master's degree in modern trombone, where I studied at BU with Don Lucas.
Hmm.
So I was here for 2 years, from 2006 to 2008. And then I left Boston for about a year to tour with a group that did children's shows, actually. So it was sort of contemporary music. And we went around the country. And then after a year of doing that, I came back because I had sort of decided, wow, that was really fun. I really missed doing historical performance. It's really what I really love. And Boston is kind of a mecca for learning historical performance. It was where a lot of the field really got started. Some really great players in the scene were here and are still here. So I came back and I've been here ever since. I think cumulatively I've been here about 14 years.
Wow. Who are some of those players that were attracting you to the scene?
Well, they're one of the oldest historical performance orchestras, which actually didn't start as a historical performance orchestra, is here, the Handel and Haydn
Hmm.
Society. There's also Boston Baroque, the Boston Camerata, all just real sort of legacy groups where a lot of this began. And as well, there's some really great historical trombone players that live here. Mac Ramsey is an incredible bass sackbut specialist. There's Eric Schmaltz, who lives in Connecticut, but within driving distance of the city, who's just a wonderful player and colleague. I knew Stephen Lundahl, who played um, historical trombone with Boston Baroque for almost 30 years. And besides trombone players, there's just so many people of different instrument specialties to learn from who, as you mentioned, the Renaissonics and John Tyson, just so many people who have studied historical performance and can pass on that information. So, um, yeah.
Wow. And so how did you get the bug? What what brought you to the early music? And I'm particularly interested because you said you came here for your master's and were studying um, kind of more contemporary classical music with Don Lucas. And what made you sort of lean into the earlier stuff?
Well, I actually started in my undergrad. When I was at Eastman, I started playing sackbut and actually studied with Greg Ingalls, who was in New York at the time, and he eventually became my professor at BU when I went back for my doctorate. But I've always loved the sound of it, really. I mean, I love the sonority, and I would listen to CDs all the time back when there were CDs of, Renaissance vocal music. And I knew even before I started playing sackbut that that was music that I just loved and wanted to play as much as possible. So I started sackbut sort of long before I specialized in it. But when the writing was on the wall, I really started to dive in and kind of made the decision by going back to school several years later for my DMA to study it, and was I think, a really good decision.
So, did you do your DMA in Boston too?
I did also at BU, but in their historical performance program. And Greg Ingalls, I was really fortunate that they um, were willing to let me study with him because he actually didn't teach at BU at the time, but I knew that he was the person I wanted to learn from. He's a real pioneer in the historical trombone world here in the States. So I was really fortunate to get to work with him.
Wow, that's amazing. So, what was the transition like from being in academia as a master's student and a doctoral student into becoming more professional within that world?
Oh, that's a good question. I think um, it sort of went in tandem together. Getting a DMA in historical trombone was a much different animal than getting a master's in modern trombone. Um, in my master's degree, I was sort of doing what you would typically expect, practicing excerpts, taking auditions, playing symphony orchestras, freelancing, everything that sort of goes with that territory. But when I started to study historical performance, I was much more autonomous. Until a couple of other students joined me, I was the only sackbut student at BU. Um, and I sort of got the freedom to pursue my own specialties. So I ended up gravitating toward sort of late Renaissance and early Baroque music, which has just amazing repertoire for the trombone, a lot of which we don't really have access to in modern programs, but it's incredibly virtuosic and incredibly satisfying to play. And I guess sort of in tandem with that, I started to eventually gig here in Boston and then started traveling to play with other professional groups. Um, and my teacher Greg really helped with that, and my colleagues here in Boston, which it was really great to be able to sort of learn alongside them as I started to play more in the professional world.
Yeah. What were some of those? What are like some of the specific pieces that you really enjoyed playing? Some of those early virtuosic pieces, some of the composers, or
Sure. I think one of the first two composers that really opened my eyes to what's out there were Matthias Weckmann, who is um, a composer who wrote for the Habsburg court, and it's chamber music where everybody plays sort of their own line for violin and dulcian, which is the early version of the bassoon. And there are trombone parts, which are just crazy. They're like, 3 octave range, extremely fast and florid. Um, and they're stunningly beautiful. I mean, it's a really complicated, very complex music. And then similarly, but a very different style, was the music by Dario Costello, which is also for sort of groups of different kinds of instruments that would all play together, but more of an Italian style. So you hear a lot of very sort of complex lines that sort of came out of this ornament tradition, which turned into more complex chamber music as time went on. But
hmm.
equally florid parts for trombones, which when when Greg introduced me to Costello, I was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea this was out there, and it's really fun. It's also Costello, I would say more so than Beckmann, is a really good starting place for trombonists who are playing at a high level but haven't yet been introduced to this type of music.
Hmm. Um, yeah, that makes me think about how when when I was working with John a little bit, I didn't know very much and I barely scratched the surface, but I started to understand that um, I guess at the time it seems like there was, it's easy to just say, oh, Baroque or early music as kind of like a giant umbrella, but that's way too general of a term. And when you really dig into it, there's like very specific stuff for like early French music versus early German music versus early Italian music, and it's going to be like wildly different. I was wondering if you have a specialty or a preference.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And in fact, a lot of people are starting to get away from that phrase early music because it's sort
Hmm.
of, when you think about it, it implies, you kind of think about a very specific type of early music, often from the Renaissance or even medieval periods. That was sort of when early music came into vogue around the 70s, that was sort of like how people thought of it. And we're starting to say historical performance instead, which can actually be applied really to any kind of stylistic playing, even into the 20th century. As far as what I love, I mean, 17th century music is my favorite thing, as well as sort of late 16th century. I love how right around that time, which is also the golden age for the trombone. I mean, this was when the instrument really came into its own. It was playing with every single ensemble that you can possibly imagine, largely because the technology was so new. It was the only brass instrument that could play chromatically, and also it could tune spontaneously, unlike other instruments which had frets or holes or keys. So it was therefore versatile enough that you could stick it in a choir, or you could stick it in a chamber ensemble, or could play bass parts, continual lines, and be able to sound good and basically do whatever the ensemble needed. So there's just, I mean, I know that there's a massive amount of repertoire that still even hasn't been transcribed yet, that, it's sitting in libraries and archives. So there's just such a variety of music, which makes that time period really special.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I appreciate the semantics. That can be really tricky sometimes when trying to describe genres.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, what have been some of your favorite places to play around town? Like, what are some of your favorite venues to play in?
I would say that playing in Symphony Hall was amazing. I've only gotten to do it a couple of times, but the times I did it was, I mean, the acoustics are unparalleled. It's just a great experience. Um, I play a lot at First Church Cambridge, which is sort of a hotspot for early music performances, historical performance. They're just very friendly to musicians there, and it's a good space both to be in the audience and on well, I guess it's the altar, but it's the stage when it's a concert. Let me think what else. Boston Baroque obviously is usually in Jordan Hall, which is, everyone knows what a beautiful space that is. I think one of the loveliest places I ever got to play was the courtyard of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which is one of
Hmm.
my favorite places in this city. It's
Yeah.
just magical. So doing an event there was really, really special.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so how do you see the future of historical performance? Do you feel like, I don't know, is there more interest from audiences? Is there more interest from players, or what's your trajectory, or what would you suspect?
That is an excellent, excellent question. I think that the state of historical performance has evolved very quickly since I started doing it, I guess, in the early 2000s. Um, since then, the Juilliard School has started a very, very well known program, and I think a lot more young people have gotten very interested in it. As well here in Boston, you have programs at BU. There's some stuff going on at Longy. There's a lot of also amateur enthusiast groups, which are just really cool. Um, it's a really cool community of people who just love it and want to continue studying it. So I think there's a good mix of sort of young professionals who are interested in seeing where they can take it, which is really exciting. And then we have this amateur community of enthusiasts who are going to support those professionals. So I'm pretty optimistic, actually. I would love to see it, the repertoire expand. I think there's some good stuff happening right now where prior to the pandemic, we started to get a little pigeonholed. There's a lot of playing sort of the great composers of the canon, Bach and Mozart, who are wonderful, and we always want to play music by them. But sort of expanding outward to play works by lesser known composers or maybe marginalized populations who sort of, we may not know about works that they wrote just based on the external circumstances of their lives. So that's a direction that I'm really hoping that players in the field will start to take things. And I'm already seeing it. There's some good stuff happening.
Wow, that's super interesting. And I'm wondering, could you elaborate more specifically about some of the marginalized populations, I guess maybe composers or players of the time who were unsung and kind of buried in time that you and maybe other people are interested in sort of resurrecting their work and all that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's two elements to this question. The first is the people themselves, and I can speak particularly to Jewish musicians in the time period that I specialize in, sort of in um, the late Renaissance, early Baroque, and even into the High Baroque. There were quite a lot of musicians that we think were Jewish, but converted sort of in the wake of the Inquisition. And then some who were outwardly Jewish, but not very many. Salomone Rossi is a really good example of the sort of one person everybody thinks about when they think about a Jewish composer who actually published works openly as a Jew. So my ensemble is doing a lot with that right now, sort of contextualizing that music, looking into who was writing music, what they were writing it for, what their origins might be, and also the integration with more well-known composers. So, for example, Claudio Monteverdi worked with Salomone Rossi in Mantua, which is a connection that a lot of people don't know about, which is good to sort of bring into context because you have this very famous guy who wrote a lot of music that we're very familiar with, but there are also people that he was working with who were very, very well known and whose music gets played less for various reasons, many of which are beyond their control. And then I think the other side of this is sort of addressing um, various types of music and what it was used for. Where my ensemble is doing a program of music in colonial America, sort of like colonial Florida, and then in Central America and Mexico. And we also have to sort of be very honest about who brought that music over, why it was played, the effect that it had on indigenous populations. For example, there was this beautiful Renaissance polyphony that was brought over to the American colonies, which a lot of the native populations learned and apparently performed very beautifully. But this music was also sometimes used for the not so great tool of evangelizing. So I think those two elements of the music we perform, I think a lot of people in the field are starting to look at it with sort of wide open eyes, um, and be really sort of honest about where it came from and how we're using it today.
That's really incredible. I think it's really remarkable how you're able to not only contextualize the music and the players and the instruments and sort of, I guess, more like specifically artistic stuff, but also the greater context of the politics and the time and the history and the peoples and movements. I mean, even just talking about the Inquisition and how that affects people and players and music. I found that really interesting. I've been more interested in exploring my own Ashkenazi heritage as Ashkenazi Jewish person, and trying to learn some Yiddish and learning more about that and understanding that history through the more commonly understood, like klezmer and all of that. And that's a whole thing to unpack, and it's very rich, and folk songs versus religious songs and all this other kind of stuff. But it's interesting how you're describing Jewish people in Europe, Ashkenazi people in Europe, kind of maybe in like high art, or like kind of doing more court music, or like in kind of higher positions in society, and how they struggled. You know,
Hmm.
they weren't necessarily accepted. So I think it's really remarkable that you're able to resurrect some of the music and the players, and also to tell the stories of the people. Um, and that's also super interesting, considering what you were saying about the history of some of this music that was brought over by colonial folks, colonizing people in the Americas and whatnot, and how indigenous people here were learning it, um, and what was their role in it. So it's kind of
Hmm.
a maybe ugly and beautiful thing at the same time. It's beautiful that they were able to partake and contribute, and it was also a very sad overtone to the colonial process and the way that they were harmed.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I think that's really amazing that you're not only playing this music but also sharing these stories.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that's a big part of historical performance. What makes it so important? It's not just, you know, a lot of it is, of course, the types of instruments and, playing historical replicas and playing stylistically how, we try to come close to how we think they might have sounded. But the context of the music is equally important.
it's funny that it's like it's in the name historical performance, and you could say all all performance is historical. It's kind of silly,
You could.
and it's kind of again semantics and how we perceive these things, and the history of the performance at that time, and the whole gestalt of politics in the world at that time is equally important to any other historical period.
Absolutely.
So it's um kind of funny, and again a little bit sad that I feel like maybe I feel like probably in performances where you're playing is described like historical performance, people are expecting that. Oh, I want to hear the history. Maybe more so than with other genres, and people will just listen to Beethoven or whatever and just say, "Oh, I don't really care about the history. I just want to hear Beethoven." Or
Hmm.
I don't really care about the history of Miles Davis. I just want to hear him play. I don't care. I don't care about the politics. He just made some cool music, and that was cool. But these things these things are part of a greater history. You know,
Hmm.
Miles Davis is a response to the times. Beethoven is a response to the times, and the
Hmm.
music that you're playing is also a response to those times. I think it really is so important to keep keep the history of these musics in your heart, because when it's lost, it's kind of tragic. You lose a whole lot with it.
Hmm. Yeah,
It's maybe even
absolutely.
dangerous too if you lose the history. It can be misappropriated.
Yes, I think it can be very dangerous, and there have been I'm sure you've been following some of the conversations in the trombone world about various pieces of music that we have, like Lass's trombone being sort of the big one, but um, pieces of music that have been sort of just a part of what we do that we become unaware of how they were used and the history of the piece, and then of course you get into all these questions about like the art versus the artist, and stuff that is a real can of worms, but a can of worms that probably should be open. It is interesting though what you say about of sort of just listening. There are people who go to concerts and they just want to hear the music, and I think that's actually also totally fair. Music um, can be both things. And what originally attracted me to historical performance, yes, it's the stories, but it was also just the pure sonorities that a pure major third at the end of a piece of polyphony is just so incredibly satisfying. Like I would just want to, I want to listen to that music all day. It's beautiful. So I think as with all art, you have so many different aspect to it. And same as people were listening to music when this polyphony was written, or hearing madrigals being sung in the streets, a lot of people just listened to it for pleasure. But with historical performance, we have that luxury of looking at these pieces more deeply and exploring not only how they sound, but what they mean.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, if you don't mind, I'd be curious to hear, sort of on a diversion from this, um, about your experiences as a woman musician and what that's meant for you, either within like the more contemporary classical world or the more older classical historical performance world. How how's that been for you?
How has it been for me? Hmm. I think when I started playing the trombone, and for quite a long time, I didn't have a strong awareness of the fact that I was in the minority. I I grew up in New Jersey, and the other trombonist who I was always sort of neck and neck with, in regional bands and stuff like that, was also a girl. Um, and Even when I got to college, there were only a few women in the studio. I think it was something for a long time that um, I saw, but I didn't really think about. But I did start to think about it probably as I um, left my master's degree and started to work in the professional world, and then started to work more deeply in historical performance. And I feel very lucky. I think not all women in male-dominated fields are lucky that they had colleagues who treated me equally. Um, all of my teachers were male, but they were all very, very supportive. I never felt marginalized by them. At the same time, I was aware that I kind of sometimes made a splash. I would have audience members come up to me after historical performance concerts and say stuff like, "What's it like to be a woman playing the trombone?" And I was always very confused by that question. Like, well, what's it like to be a man playing the trombone? Like, I don't know. I don't really know how to answer you. Like, I practice and play and think about the music the same as anybody else, so it's not very strange to me. But at the same time, I at the toward the end of my doctorate, I actually got hooked up with this wonderful um, person who became another one of my mentors. Her name is Rebecca Sipis, and she's not a trombonist; she's a musicologist at Rutgers University, and she kind of took me under her wing and helped me out with some fellowships applications as I was working on my dissertation. And one of the fellowships I applied for and I eventually received was through a program called the American Association of University Women. And if there are any women listening to this podcast, I highly recommend looking into it. It's a wonderful organization that supports women and girls in their professional and academic ventures. And as I applied for this fellowship and I started to write and think about my role as a woman in the field of trombone, I realized that um, I actually never had the experience of see, seeing a woman on stage playing. And I realized that that alone was something that I could do to sort of influence future women and girls who might want to go into this field. Just, I think, as with anything, um, any field that can be sort of, exclusive in a way, if you see somebody like you doing it, then it might encourage you to do it too. And I think I'm a lot more aware of that than I used to be. I'm a lot more aware that I can help maybe people like me when they're at a younger age to feel sort of excited about going into this. There aren't too many women sackbut players in the US. There are a few, but not too many. So this is another thing that I think this awareness is a really important development in my own professional life that I hope to pursue further.
That's a really beautiful sentiment. You can't really change the past, but just your mere existence, just you existing, being you, can can change the future just by being an example and being here. Do you do any education or outreach? Have you had any like tangible effects on kids or up and coming players that you can recall?
I hope so. I I do teach. I do in particular quite a lot of continuing education with amateurs. I have guest taught at several universities, and I have taught some young women who sort of played historical trombone as an elective on the side, who I hope enjoyed doing it. I think the most important thing, though, is my ensemble has sort of a policy that wherever we go to perform a concert, like say we're doing something in a concert hall, um, we make sure that we do at least one community event, that we go to a place where people might not necessarily have access to the music that we're doing in a concert situation. So we'll do like a workshop at a school, or we'll go to a senior center, or um, we'll do a master class somewhere, um, just to bring the music and the visibility of the music to people who might want to enjoy it. So I think that's something that's really important to me and is going to continue being really important.
That's amazing. What are some of the most memorable community events that you've done?
With my ensemble, we did a few in Louisville. We went to our players are all over the U.S., so we end up in very interesting places. But when we were in Kentucky, we went to a senior center there, and we sort of previewed our program um, for them. We also did a master class, well, more like a workshop for the trombonists who are at a performing arts school nearby. Um, Let me think. Oh, we also, when we performed in Rochester, we did sort of a morning show for the public school students there. Um,
What was the
and there were,
reception? What did the kids think?
it's generally positive. I think sometimes we blow their minds a little bit because we're playing these instruments that are very unusual, um, that you don't see very often. They look funny, they don't look like normal trombones. Um, but I think one thing that's been also important in doing that work is to, it's quite a privilege for me to be able to have these instruments. They're very expensive,
Mm.
and I've been able, through um, yes, hard work, but also circumstance, been able to acquire them. And one thing that we like to say when we sort of go out to these places is, okay, I understand that your school might not have a set of sackbuts for you to play, but this music is still here for you. And you can
Hmm.
learn it, and you can appreciate it, and you can perform it in a way on your modern instruments that still gives you that pleasure and that satisfaction. And then, it's up to you whether you want to pursue it further, but just to hand over that little bit of um, enjoyment and maybe something new to people that might have not seen it before or heard it before, really.
Hmm. That makes me wonder, thinking about instruments. Um, Pardon my ignorance, but do you have like an original sackbut from like hundreds of years ago, or is it a remake, like a modern made replica instrument?
It is a replica.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, the originals are either in museums, or, well, mostly in museums, or collections. Not many of them survived. I think the last time I checked, funnily enough, there were 76 surviving trombones. Um, from this time period. I don't know if that number is still accurate. I think it might have changed. Um, but a lot of the makers like Meinl and Edgar and some other makers will take those. There's a lot of resources as, the kinds of metals that were used, and of course the instruments themselves that they can study, and drawings that survived and stuff like that, that you can make very reasonable and very, very accurate replicas.
Wow. Have you ever played on an original sackbut?
Alas, no. I would like to someday. It would be a really cool experience.
Yeah. Or what about a serpent? Do you ever play that?
I don't play Serpent. Serpent is a whole different animal. It's
Okay.
yeah, that's I have no idea how to play Serpent, unfortunately, but there's some really great players out there.
Okay. For those listening, the serpent has like a literal construction of a serpent head as the instrument bell. So it's kind of a fun novelty. Um, what about your mouthpiece? Do you have like a plastic or like a bone mouthpiece? Because that's the traditional way, right?
No, actually, the mouthpieces would have also been some combination of metals, brass or even silver.
Okay.
Um, yeah, the main difference is the shape of it. It's very conical. The rim and the shank are very sharp and flat, and that sort of helps the articulation of the player to come out very crisply, sort of mimic the sound of the human voice.
Hmm. Super cool. How many sackbuts do you own?
Oh boy, I've got a Baroque alto, a Baroque tenor. I've got a classical alto and a classical tenor. So those were based off models from I think 1735. I think. Um, I've got a medieval slide trumpet, which was the sackbut's predecessor. It was a chromatic instrument with a single slide, and it's really crazy to play. It looks like a straight trumpet, like a natural trumpet. It's got one loop, but
Hmm.
it's got what looks like a long lead pipe, and you move the entire instrument up and down the lead pipe.
Wow.
So when I first learned it, I had to be very careful not to bash myself in the face. So you're basically bringing the whole instrument at you when you go into first position.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. So, from a technical perspective, how do you keep up with all these instruments? I was just talking with a student earlier about the difficulty of navigating similar but different instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you keep in shape on all these different instruments?
Well, one good thing is that the trombone is pretty much the least changed instrument of any Western instrument that we're familiar with. So the fundamentals of trombone playing don't change.
Hmm.
Um, Certainly, if switching between modern and early trombones, which I don't do as much anymore, but I used to do it quite often. You do really have to sort of um, put yourself in the in the mindset where you just kind of flip a switch and you're like, okay, I'm playing my orchestral shires now, so that means I need sort of a larger, more open airstream, and I can play a little bit fuller. And it's a sort of to me it was more in my mind. It was like, okay, what's the function of this instrument? What am I using it for? And then sort of thinking about it that way rather than think like, oh my god, this mouthpiece is huge, and this mouthpiece is like super tiny. And of course, that is an element to it. You can't, I can't say that it's not. Um, and Everybody has different ways of doubling. But I think it's not too much different than if you're, a studio player or a Broadway player where you're a freelancer and you're playing, you have to play a lot of different instruments, and it's sort of the way it is, and the ones you're doing the most, maybe you'll practice a little more at that time. But Yeah, I think that's kind of it.
Um, so you were telling me before that you have performances coming up with your group. You mind saying more about that?
Sure. So my ensemble in Cantare, we're very excited after not performing for a year and a half, like the rest of us. We finally have a season, so we'll be traveling to New York and New Jersey and Minnesota and Florida, and doing some residencies and some concerts, especially if we have this program called Exile, which is based on the Jewish musicians that we spoke about earlier, which I'm really excited. And then this New World program of, sort of branching outward from colonial Florida. Um, so I'm really pumped to start touring again.
That's amazing. Super cool. Um, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about we kind of talked about it earlier, but just like the Boston Early Music Festival, because I was really struck when I was there. It just seemed like such a huge thing, and I don't know, it's so remarkable, and I just felt so unaware of it. It's like I had no inkling of this thing, and then I was there, and so it's like suddenly, wow, there's so many players and audience members and so many performances and venues, and there's so much going on here, and I had just no awareness of it. Could you talk about that a little bit? Your experience with it, or yeah.
Sure. I actually, my experience is somewhat limited. I only played in the Orfeo production that one summer, but it does happen every other year, and it is a very big deal. They sort of have these and it's been long, sort of a long time early music institution here in Boston, and I know that it's quite well known throughout the world. They usually will have these sort of headline events. There's always an opera. They'll bring in a lot of guest artists from other parts of the world, and then there's this associated fringe festival where a lot of times sort of younger groups will come in and do concerts throughout the week, sort of in tandem with the headline events. So it's a big deal. You if you wanted to, you could go to concerts like 12 hours a day. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Um, do you ever do any work with dancers or theater? I mean, you were just talking about the theater Orfeo thing. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. I think a lot of times opera is the main outlet for that. Well, I keep saying last fall, but it's actually 2 years ago. This pandemic has really messed up my sense of time. But there are groups like Opera Lafayette and Tafel Music, which is in Toronto, and Opera Atelier, which do these very elaborate historical performance productions, which are really exciting to have the opportunity to play in. Especially Opera Atelier did Don Giovanni last fall, and that was really cool because they always have dancers come in, professional dancers, and to go along with the production, and very elaborate sets, and that always leads to interesting adventures in the pit. When we performed in Toronto, there wasn't room for the trombone section in the actual pit. And because of the way the hall was set up, it was this, very beautiful kind of Broadway-esque hall with like box seats and sort of a very high, round setup. And the pit was very tiny. So they set the trombone section up in one of the boxes. So we ended up coming in, it's 3 hours where we don't play, and then like you're like it's like trombones. So we basically came in during the last act, and we sat down in our box, and basically looked at the conductor from sort of behind into the side and hoped we caught his cue, and came in when Don Giovanni got sent down to hell. So yeah, those experiences can be very enlightening and very
So you sent
adventurous.
them to hell.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, when I was doing some of those gigs with John Tyson, we did one that was like a really interesting kind of interdisciplinary thing. Like we did some that were just instrumental, which was beautiful and great in and of itself, but there's a really fun one that really sticks out in my mind. There's actually a link of it on YouTube if anyone's really curious and they want to see me in costume garb on stage. Anyways,
Cool.
but um, yeah, it was kind of a fun collaboration. There's like all kinds of almost like a variety show. There's people doing almost like stunts and people on stilts and doing all kinds of like really silly, zany performances. So that was kind of a really fun window into the breadth and diversity of, I don't know, that kind of performance. What can exist from
Hmm.
opera to instrumental to almost like a variety show kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just like today, that time period was it was vastly diverse as far as kinds of music and the kinds of music that was used. I think sometimes when we think of like Renaissance music, we think of one specific thing, but it really was just like today. You know, we have so many different kinds of music we listen to in so many different places, and you know, dance halls and bars and
Different
street musicians,
functions.
and
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it was just the same.
Yeah. Um, I know one interesting sort of thing in like what I've heard from more from players who specialize in like contemporary classical music that there can be a bit of a um I don't know, I guess difference in style and mentality between American classical players and European classical players. And there's like kind of a rift, maybe like,
Hmm.
oh, like if I'm an American and I want to try to join a European orchestra, I might have to get a different instrument and I might have to kind of really learn a kind of very different approach to playing. Is there a similar kind of dynamic between like American historical performance and European players?
It's a good question that I'm not sure I can answer fully, since I haven't worked extensively in Europe. I don't think, though, that that sort of major rift you're talking about with modern instrumentalists exists as much. I think because the very nature of historical performance is that everyone is kind of trying to find out the same thing. So it's sort of unlikely that, you know, I did play with a Belgian group once when they came here to tour, and you know, I didn't show up with my. I mean, my instrument was made in Europe, and so there was no sort of like, why are you playing that, or like, why are you playing like that? I didn't. I wasn't aware of any sort of those feelings. I think, as with any regional differences, you are going to have difference in style. There are going to be, you know, different traditions. Um, Different teachers will have passed down different techniques. I think there is unfortunately a kind of divide, but that has more to do with like visa issues and funding, than, you know, the desire of people to play together, which kind of prevents a more integrated um, um, community between Europe and the United States, and not just Europe and the United States. I mean, this stuff is going on all over the world. There's a big scene in Japan, um, and and also in South America. There's quite a lot of interest in early music. So um, I think that if it were possible, people would be very enthusiastic about being more integrated on a global level. But because of the way things are politically and financially and all that stuff, it can be kind of a tough sell.
Yeah. Um, so for people, what would be your advice for people listening who are either maybe interested in listening more to some of that music, or for players who might be interested in trying to learn more and get more involved? What would you say to them?
My first advice, I think, would be to reach out. Well, two pieces of advice. First is just to reach out to a player, and express interest. And I know we're all always interested in sort of evangelizing the early brass aesthetic to other people. I mean, that was the way I learned. I reached out to Greg Ingalls, and he sort of opened this door to, you know, this whole world that I didn't know existed, and it was really exciting. Um, and you know, if you're at a university, if you're, if you're studying, modern trombone, your university probably has a historical performance department. So you can check out what they're doing, ask how you can become involved, which also can lead to really fruitful experiences. And then as far as the other piece of advice, listening is just is just wonderful. Seek out groups, concerts to go to, recordings to listen to. The first recordings of early brass music were that I listened to were probably the classics. Concerto Palatino was sort of the seminal early brass group that really kind of was groundbreaking and um,
Hmm.
bringing historical brass performance to the next level. But there are some really beautiful groups out there. Ensemble in Alto, which is I think they're Belgian, if I'm not mistaken, has just some absolutely beautiful recordings out there. Um, yeah, the list is endless. Musica Fiata has that Beckmann that I was talking about, David Yakis, who actually was originally a New England player and now lives in Italy and does historical performance. He's a wonderful player and has a lot of great recordings. Um, Off the top of my head, those are just a few I can think of, but there are tons of them.
Hmm. So, do you have any other big up and coming plans or anything else aside from some touring with your group?
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to play at all. I'm excited that live performance is slowly coming back and to sort of get back in the scene. I'm actually moving to Chicago in 2022 to
Hmm.
take over the artistic directorship of the Newberry Consort, which will be a very exciting new chapter.
Wow,
I've spent,
congratulations.
oh, thank you. I've spent I love Boston. It's such a wonderful place to be a musician and to play. And so that's, it's kind of bittersweet. I love it here.
Hmm.
It's a wonderful city to be a trombonist.
Yeah,
But it is exciting to think about next things.
sure. How are you feeling about that transition? Like what's your sense of the Chicago music scene for what you're doing and Chicago as a city for a living?
Well, it'll definitely be different. Chicago is vast. It's much, Boston has this sort of feeling of being a small town. It's also very concentrated. There's so many music schools here and so many players, which I'm sure, as you know, can be both really rewarding, but also sometimes make it difficult to have that level of sort of concentration. Um, Chicago, I think that's sort of a remains to be seen question, but I'm under the impression from people I know that work there as musicians that it's a very vibrant scene, very diverse, a lot of big theater scene, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of opportunities there. So I'm excited to discover it. It should be really interesting.
Yeah, that's super exciting. Um, okay. Well, can probably wrap it up soon. Anything else that you want to say or share?
No, thank you. This has been really fun.
Good. I'm glad. I had a lot of fun too. It was really amazing learning from you, the great Dr.
Oh gosh.
Liza.
Well, I don't know about that. Thanks.
But seriously, I don't hear from a lot of people from your perspective and your vantage. So it's special to get some time and hear about what's going on kind of in your corner of the world. And I'm excited to share through the podcast with other people who are listening to know that this exists and it's vibrant and strong. It's kind of, I don't want to necessarily say insular, but kind of like easy to miss, I think. If you're not looking for it, it's easy to miss. And I think it's a really cool thing that exists. It's very special. And if possible, I want to raise awareness of it. So I'm glad to have you here to talk about it. I think it's really cool.
Well, thank you. That's awesome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully I'll see you around and maybe catch one of your local shows soon. Do you have a local date for for playing?
Not yet.
Oh
Hopefully,
yeah.
hopefully post pandemic that will happen eventually. But I'll let you know.
Yeah, let me know about when you're playing and I'll try and come and I'll share it here on the my channels too. So
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you.
cool. Thanks, Liza.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Comments, questions, send me an email at bossbonespodcast@gmail.com. That's BOSBONES podcast@gmail.com. Or follow me on Instagram, YouTube, or Spotify. For more info about Liza, you can follow her on Instagram at Liza_Malamut. That's LIZA_MALAMUT. Or www.lizamalamut.com. Trombone Icon by Gregory Montigny from thenounproject.com. Special thanks to Celine and Jeffrey. The Boss Bones theme was written and recorded by yours truly, Michael Prentke. Again, please follow at Boss Bones on Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify, or visit at michaelprentke.com/bossbones.